I have been spending the last 25 years working with security executives, IT leaders, risk executives in organizations all over the world, in all different verticals. And you know what they all have in common? They're not as effective at communicating with their business stakeholders as they think they are. What is the result of this? Well, the result is when they cut budgets, they cut hours. Why? Because you can't take my money, I'm security. Well, they're taking your money. When they go to sales and say cut costs, sales says, well, we could do that, but it's going to cost us $1 million in revenue. You go to compliance and you say, we got to cut costs, and they're going to say, well, we're going to get hit with fines. But we, on the security side, don't do a great job of communicating in the context, in the language, in the words of our business. Just like you didn't understand what I said when I first got up on stage. There we go. So this is a quote from Sidney Harris, who is a fairly well-respected journalist in the US. And I think it's important. There are two key words in here: information and communication. Information is what is given to you. Communication is about getting that through, getting it to be understood so that the people you're talking to have the context so they can make the right decisions, make the right choices, move in the direction that we want them to. And you heard in the last session some great tips and some concern about the fact that attacks are imminent. And I think we all know that that is the case. So think about whether you are communicating or whether you're informing when you're talking to your business stakeholders. So as I mentioned, I spent a long time working with folks such as yourselves, and a lot of people think they are excellent communicators. But I've also spent a lot of time talking to people on the other side of that conversation. I've been in front of about 300 boards of directors in the last 10 years. I have spoken in front of audiences of CEOs, COOs, CFOs, and I can tell you, none of those people think you're very good at getting your message across. So we're going to talk about 4 things that you can bring back to the office tomorrow, or if you're playing hooky on Friday like I am, on Monday. So the first thing is you have to learn to speak their language, right? We can't keep using our language. We can't keep communicating in those made-up languages that I started off with. I actually am a little disappointed that no one in here knows Sindarin or Dothraki, though. Because that's the audience, right? Everyone should know these things. So learn how to speak their language and stop talking in ours, right? When you talk to your peers, your teams, you can use whatever words and language you want. As a great example, the word risk. If any of you are in financial services and you talk about risk to somebody who's on the trading desk or somebody that's running an equities department, they hear it in a very, very different way than we mean it as security and IT people, right? The second tip is you have to learn to be a storyteller. Once upon a time, those are probably the most powerful words in any language. When I say them, the hair stands up on my arms. We don't tell stories. We throw data at people, and they don't know what to make of it. They have no context. They don't know what decisions they make, and they will give you whatever they think you want, so you go away as fast as possible. The third tip is about focusing more on the emotional element rather than on the numbers, the hard data. And I'll give you some examples a little bit later about how that works and how it doesn't work. And then finally, you need to understand the risk appetite of your business stakeholders. How much risk is okay for them? And then we need to do our thing accordingly. So the first thing is speak the language of your business. So there was an interesting article I found on LinkedIn last week. It was a report of a speech given by somebody very high up in the US federal government. And what this person said was, cybersecurity needs to be a core business risk. I agree. How many of you agree? Everybody should agree. But then the person went on to say, the time to deal with ransomware is not after our network gets crashed. What's wrong with that? The network crashing is not a business problem, it's a technical problem. Your business audiences don't know what that means. All they know is you're making excuses. Instead, if you said, we need to deal with ransomware before it has an impact on our billing system and keeps us from sending bills out to our customers so we don't get paid, that your business cares about. So here's what a lot of us tend to talk about, and I've been guilty of this on many occasions, right? We talk about hackers and vulnerabilities and patches and all kinds of things. That's the stuff we care about. That's the stuff security cares about, IT cares about, operations cares about. Your business, they don't care about any of those things. Your business cares about three things. Money coming in, right? Revenue, customers, market share. Money going out, expenses and efficiency. And the third one, when something goes sideways, who gets in trouble? That's it. That's what they care about. So we need to start to think about using these words and these terms. If we don't address this risk, here's how the business is going to have a problem. Here's how the business is going to suffer. Now, I will share with you a cloud-related conversation I had with someone a couple years ago. The business went to IT and said, we're moving payroll to the cloud on Monday. But it's Friday. Yeah, I know. We want to know if it's okay with the security team. And by the way, we don't really care what you say. Here's a contract. So the CISO looked at it, said, no, this is a super bad idea. Why? Because they don't have good security. The business signed the contract and they pushed it into the cloud. Because not having good security doesn't mean anything. What we need to talk about is, well, when we move it into the cloud, if there's a network outage on their end, we can't pay people. Are we okay with that? We no longer have control over our payroll data, which will put us in violation of myriad regulations across the world. Are we okay with that? So getting that business context is what we need to focus on. We don't want to we want to focus on hackers and patches and vulnerabilities, but when we talk to our management, they are not interested in hearing anything about that. They know what they read in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, or see online or hear from their friends. So what are some of the tips you can do to help with this? So the first thing you can do is you can take some business classes. There are tons of free resources out there. Does anyone know how to read a P&L or a balance statement? You should. Does anyone know what the most profitable line item in your general ledger is? You should, because that's what your business cares about, right? Pilot your message. So try telling your stories to a smaller audience, maybe somebody that you already know that gets risk. Sometimes people in the CFO's office are good with risk discussions because that's what they do, operations people. So you want to pilot your message and see, are people paying attention or are they looking at their phones? The third thing is about pausing. Wait to hear what your audience says or see what they feel. If we don't give them any time to inject, we're not communicating, we're giving them information. So you want to pause. You want to give them an opportunity to respond. And I will be the first one to tell you I'm not a great pauser. My wife frequently accuses me of stepping all over her. I'm working on it. It's the best I can say. And then ask your audience for feedback. Is this helpful? Are we ready to make a decision? Is there any other information I can provide for you before we make a decision? So you got to ask them. Don't tell them. If you tell them no, they will ignore you, and we will continue to have the reputation that we have now in security and IT, which is, oh yeah, those are the people that get in the way. So the second thing, and this is actually one of my favorite topics, which is storytelling. Right? Once upon a time, all those good things. Storytelling is essentially a simple concept. It is innate to humans. We all can be good storytellers. It does take practice, but it's just very simple. Conveying in words or images, sometimes using improvisation or embellishment, right? Exaggerating to make your point. so that we can either inform and educate, influence a decision, or change a behavior. Sometimes all three. The more you can hit on these, the better off you will be. Stories don't have to be really, really long. Sometimes they can be 30-second stories. Have you ever, I know no one knows them anymore because no one watches real TV, but commercials. Good commercials are 30-second stories. Now, I know it's not comfortable for everybody. I love being on stage. If I did nothing but get on stage, that would be a perfect job for me. I love telling stories. Not everybody is that comfortable with it, but it's something that you need to learn. If you just throw a bunch of data at your audience, they're not going to know what to do with it. A former colleague and friend of mine named Tina Nuno, she used to go in front of a lot of boards, and she said, if you give the boards data without interpreting it for them, they will take the wrong point away, guaranteed 100% of the time. So watch movies. Good movies are good stories. You can read books as well. It's interesting. So my daughter, she's going to be 17 next week. She is an avid reader, and she knows I love science fiction. So she gave me a book that she read and she wanted me to read. And, reading through it, and it was a great story. The guy was a terrible writer, but the story was interesting, and it kept me engaged. Right? So we get that engagement, we get people paying attention, and then we can get our point across much more effectively as opposed to just throwing a number at them. Right? So years ago, I used to work at a company called Martha Stewart Omnimedia. You may have heard of Martha. My relationship with Martha was actually quite good, mostly because I set expectations correctly. But Martha had computers in 8 different locations. And once every 3 or 4 months, I would get a phone call. Jeffrey, I need you to get rid of my passwords. I can't take it anymore. And I would say, okay, Martha, I'll do that for you. But do you remember when you had to fight with the dog walker last week? She went, yeah. I said, well, if you have no password, your dog walker can go to your computer, send a threatening letter to the president, and the Secret Service is showing up here tomorrow. You okay with that? Well, no. So I said, well, maybe we probably shouldn't take the passwords off your computer. You guys know, in fact, whether I work for Martha Stewart? No, I did. Did that story actually happen? I don't know. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But it doesn't matter. You can make stories up if you have a point to prove, and it's perfectly okay. You got to be able to defend them, though. Create analogies and comparisons. Right? That's a very, very important part of any good story. Create a one-pager. How many of you have an elevator pitch for yourself? If I stopped you in the hall and said, 30 seconds, what do you do? You should build that. That's your first story. Who am I? Right? Think about creating a one-pager, creating a bio, so that you know what your brand is. And that's good practice for then creating a brand statement for the security function, for the IT function, for the risk function. All of these are stories. And then here's the one for people that don't feel that comfortable. You have to practice, right? Some people it comes very naturally, some people not as much. So you can practice in front of the mirror. You can practice in front of your spouse, as long as you have a spouse unlike mine who will not laugh at you, because my wife will totally laugh at me, and does on a regular basis, in fact. But the practice is where you get more comfortable. Have any of you ever seen the movie Reservoir Dogs? So in Reservoir Dogs, and I won't ruin the story, there's an undercover cop, and the way they get the undercover officer in with the bad guys is they give him a story to tell. And what does he do? He practices it over and over and over and over again. And he gets in with the bad guys, and then you should watch the movie because other stuff happens. If you don't like bad words, though, don't watch that movie, because that's pretty much all they have. The third thing is about feelings versus facts. Feelings do not equal facts. Just because you believe and feel something does not mean it is a true statement. When we communicate, we have found that the emotional hook is often much, much more important than the actual data. So data may persuade people, but it doesn't necessarily inspire action or change. For that, you need to get that emotional hook dug in, right? So take your vision, your thought, what's your endpoint, and work backwards from there. And then I love this quote from Carl Buhner, which basically talks about the fact that people will forget what you say to them, but they will remember how you made them feel. So when you're going to your executives, how do you want them to feel? Do you want them to be afraid? Maybe. Do you want them to be concerned but confident in your ability? Maybe. Think about what feelings you want to evoke. So some tips here. Be careful about data. There is a quote that is attributed to a bunch of different people. I like Mark Twain just because I like Mark Twain. There are 3 kinds of lies in the world: lies, damn lies, and statistics. We can take those numbers and we can make them tell any story we want. That's why the emotional piece is important. Understand your audience's triggers. Right? If you're in a vertical where there's just been a big breach, people are going to have heightened sensitivity to the messaging. So you want to start to think about that. You also, again, piloting, right? We talked about that in the first section. So pilot your messages, pilot your stories. You don't have to pilot word for word, but you want to pilot the elements of your story. Right? One of my favorite stories, and I pulled it out of here in the interest of time, but the hero's journey is a very, very well-known archetypal story. And basically the story is quite simple. Something bad happens to a village, a town, whatever. There is a hero who does not want to be a hero. He gets sent out. He goes after the evil. He loses, and he runs away. And then he finds his way to the mentor, the wise man, the hermit, the man who gives him the magic weapon. And he gets reinvigorated, and he goes after the evil again. He is victorious, and he goes home. So who are you in this story? You're not the hero. You're the wise man. And the magic weapon you give is cybersecurity. So you can build stories based on that as well. And then if you have time and interest, you should take a look at the concept of scenario planning. A guy named Peter Schwartz, he created it when he worked for Shell Oil a bunch of years ago. It's a very, very interesting thing. You should definitely take a look at it, and it leads to some interesting conversations. Then finally, and this is always a moving target, we need to understand what is your business's appetite for risk. This is not one thing. It's not a number. But we need to think about how much risk is too much. And there was an interesting article with the coming recession. They interviewed a bunch of CEOs and board members, and about 70% of them said they were probably going to increase their risk appetite over the next 2 to 3 years. Why? Because of the coming economic adjustment. We don't like to use the R word. So thinking about how much risk is too much, how much risk is your organization willing to accept, and then you can go to them with those communication conversations and tell stories and talk about, well, we're never going to get rid of all of the risk, but we can get rid of some of it by investing here or here. So think about this balancing act and recognize that the security and risk folks, you are at the fulcrum. You are how those decisions are going to be communicated and how those decisions are going to be made. So some tips here. Decide whether, in fact, you need a risk appetite discussion or document or process in your organization. If you are bigger than 50 people, you probably need at least something, even if it's an informal thing. You want to make sure you have all the stakeholders involved. This is where security frequently makes a mistake. We make decisions on behalf of other people about stuff that we don't own, about stuff that we don't know anything about, and frankly, about stuff that we don't care about. Well, that doesn't end well because you're making decisions on behalf of other people. So you want to get all those stakeholders involved. If there's a risk in your marketing system or your order management system or your fulfillment or your shipping or your logistics, whatever it may be, those people need to be involved so they understand what their exposures are if things don't get changed. You want to make sure you define your taxonomy carefully. You want to make sure that when you use the word risk, everyone in your audience uses it in the same way. About 5 or 6 years ago, I had a conversation with a CISO for a mining company. And we were talking about transitioning from information security to risk management. And she said, I can't use the word risk. And I said, oh, how come? She said, well, because a risk for us is drilling a hole in a mountain at a cost of $3 billion and not finding what we dug for. Right? Using risk there would have been a bad idea. But we tend to throw these words around without understanding how the audience is going to perceive them. And then finally, you want to make sure that you are linking these enterprise risk appetite discussions back to goals and objectives. And I'll leave you with one last thing before I wrap up. So my cousin works for an investment bank in New York City. And when COVID hit, they sent everyone home. Well, I don't know if any of you know any investment bankers, but they don't work from home. They're either in the office, or they're playing golf or whining and dining people, because that's what they do. Well, they had to send everybody home. They didn't have any computers, so they went into the lab and they pulled out all these old laptops and they sent them home with these $1 million investment bankers. Old machines, no patches, no authentication, no data encryption. Well, 3 months after they did that, they kept the business running. The CISO went, holy cow, what did we do? Well, they raised their risk appetite in order to keep the business running. So keep an eye on those things, because your risk appetite will change. The risk appetite of different leaders and executives will be very different. So let's just wrap up and then we'll send you on your way. So first thing, learn the language of the business. They are not going to learn technology. They're not going to learn cyber, and we should not expect them to. We need to learn their language because we live in their world. Tell stories. And this is an open offer for anybody. You can connect to me on LinkedIn. I love talking to people about building stories. Feel free to reach out to me. I will absolutely get on the phone with you and we can talk about storytelling. It's my favorite thing to do. Take a step back from the data and the facts and the figures and think about the emotional. How do these things land? How do people feel? There's a researcher, his name is Peter Sandman. He works out of Princeton, New Jersey. And he says risk is not likelihood times impact. He said, yeah, sure, whatever. But he says risk equals hazard plus outrage. The more upset people get, the more they will perceive it as a bigger risk. And then finally, work with your business stakeholders. Understand your risk appetite so that we can go to the cloud. We can secure these resources. We can do what the folks that were on stage before suggested we do, which is prepare for the worst. So, of course, I'm over. I will be happy to stick around if anyone has any questions, or you can feel free to stop by. I'm going back to the vendor room, so you can come by the booth, and I promise I will not try to sell you anything, although I can't speak for Rachel because she's in sales. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day, everyone.